All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal, Patreon, and the YouTube super whatever buttons are all down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. And as always, if anybody wants access to the graphs used in this video or hundreds of other kinds of graphs across all kinds of different subjects, those are all freely available through the Drive folder linked in the description. Anyways, it's time for the monthly oil production levels update for non-OPEC members. That data gets released separately. So starting with a former OPEC member, Angola, who, like many others, left because they were tired of the off and on, basically permanent production cuts. You can see a video linked in the corner about the slow disintegration and breakup of OPEC. But they peaked up at about 2 million barrels per day and have been on their way down since then. They've just been managing to stall their decline off a bit above 1 million barrels per day, but they can't hold on to that forever. This time, after dropping below 1 million, they've recovered back up to 1.11. Azerbaijan peaked up at 1.1 about a decade and a half ago, 2 decades ago, and has since declined now down to the mid 500s, this time coming in at 562,000. Argentina has become a net exporter again. Their domestic consumption, their own oil demand, hanging out usually around 700,000, although a bit unstable because of how economically unstable they usually are, and their oil production having fallen from a peak of 800 down to 400. But ever since they started fracking in the Vaca Muerta shale, they have climbed all the way back up above 800 once again, this time coming in at 827,000 barrels per day. Australia was once up at about 800,000, and they declined down into the 200s, bumped back up from that with the condensate that accompanied all that natural gas production off their northwestern coast. But now the boost from that is over, and they've fallen back down into the 200,000s again, this time at 263. Brazil earlier this year finally made it up to 4 million barrels per day, and last time they dropped back down close to 3.9 for a bit of maintenance shutdowns, but now they're back up to 4 million barrels per day this time. Canada had gotten up to about 5.2 before all the wildfires early in the summer. Those forced them to shut down, getting as low as 3.5 at one point. But they've made their way back up since then. They were back up to 5 last time, and now they're back up to even higher than they were before the wildfires, thanks to some additional expansion in some of the tar sand stuff. However, also a expansion at one of their larger offshore fields, offshore of Newfoundland and Labrador, was brought online. So now they're up to 5.25 million barrels per day. China still clinging on in the lower fours. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption has peaked, but is still much higher than their production, up at about 17 million barrels per day. This time, their production came in at 4.31. Colombia, falling down from their second peak at 1 million, has now dropped down into the mid 700,000s. They're starting their third or their next stair step drop, as has been their fashion, and they're at 746. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption, their own oil demand, has now exceeded 500,000 on average. Ecuador recovered from the shutdowns they had to do because of pipeline leaks earlier in the year, and they are this time at 468, continuing their very gradual terminal decline slope, although narrowing their export margin all the same, as their domestic consumption in present day is now up over 300,000. Egypt was once up close to a million, but over time they declined down to the 600s, then down to the 500s, now down to right around 500 itself. They were down at 486 for a little bit, but now they're back up just over 500 at 501,000 barrels per day. Ghana was once up at 214 at the highest point. They dropped down to the 150s. Some enhanced recovery operations brought them back up close to 190, from which they've been slipping down again, now down to 182. Guyana is up to around 900 now that they have 4 of their offshore fields operating. They do have some background decline beginning from the earliest 2, and with everything that is slated to officially be brought online before 2030, it's enough to where background declines included, they should reach at least 1.7 million barrels per day by 2030. But overall, including the entire outlook of their basin, They're likely to see an actual peak as the future goes on, somewhere over 2, probably even close to 3. We'll have to wait and see, but most likely. India held out at around 800,000 or so for quite a while, a few decades, but has declined back down to around 600,000 and has held out here for a bit, this time coming in at 595. Meanwhile, their own domestic oil consumption has almost reached 6 million barrels per day. Indonesia was once a decent oil producer for a while. After finally getting past World War II and the 50s, they jumped up in the 60s and got up to 1.5 million barrels per day or so, which they held for a few decades, but reached the end of their ability to maintain that. So for oil production, they have slipped all the way down to around 600, this time coming in around 596 or 597. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption is now up over 2 million barrels per day, usually around 2.1 or 2.2. Kazakhstan began this year by exceeding 2 million finally for the first time, and they got as high as 2.2 or a bit above it, but they've had some fields shut down for maintenance recently that has brought them back down to a flat 2 million barrels per day this time. Malaysia was once up around 800, but they have slipped down below 500, although some enhanced recovery stuff and some offshore minor stuff has been able to hold them out here in the upper 400s for a few years, this time coming in at 491. Mexico initially would have been a large oil producer early on in the very early times, but then their civil war happened, and then all the chaos that ensued after that happened, and then all the chaos that ensued after that happened for a few decades. But then they got their upshot once we got into the second half of the 20th century, and eventually got up to about 3.5 million barrels per day, but since then have run through their capabilities and have declined down into the upper ones, usually now around 1.7, 1.8. This time in particular, they came in at 1.74. Norway, after activating their large new field in their Arctic waters, which brought them up close to 2.2, has had to shut down a different field for offshore maintenance that has dropped them back down to 1.99 million barrels per day. Oman continuing to hold roughly around 1 million barrels per day. After being roughly around 990 for the last couple of years, they have this time just gone a few thousand back up over 1 million barrels per day. Qatar, another one who left OPEC because they didn't want to keep suppressing their own production to meet the organization's demands. They brought themselves up to 1.5 million barrels per day afterwards, and since then declined down under 1.3, but then with some enhanced recovery stuff, they were able to come back up over 1.3 for a bit, but are just starting to slip back down to it, this time coming in at 1.31 million barrels per day. Russia has made getting accurate or trustable data obnoxiously difficult, as first they just stopped publishing it, but then earlier this year they also declared oil and gas data to be classified information, so a lot of stuff now has to get worked out secondhand. But as of last time, they were down to roughly around 8.6, maybe down to 8.5, not positive. And from some trustworthy data, it looks like they were actually able to recover some of their production decline. That is over the last month or so by about 40,000 barrels per day's worth. So that would bring them back up to either 8.64 or 8.54, although Russia themselves insists in statements that they are in fact increasing their production by hundreds of thousands of barrels per day, despite previously admitting that they couldn't do so, and despite all of the extensive damage to their oil and gas infrastructure that's been done over the last few months from drone and missile strikes. But that is what they're claiming. Turkmenistan declined from their peak in the upper 200s down to roughly around 190, but have just been in that rough area. The last exact number they gave was 191, which has their export ratio rather narrow as their domestic consumption reached between 150 and 170 as of this year. The UK, long fallen dead from their North Sea heights of the past, is down under 700,000 barrels per day now, and this time came in at 649. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption is usually around 1.5 million. The US has been up around 13.5 for over a year now, and this time actually came in over 13.6 again. as it had declines down to 13.3 with shale on its decline. However, the activation of a few larger fields in the Gulf and also a decently sized field back up home in Alaska gave a compounding set of upward lunges or jumpstart numbers that was able to erase a couple 100,000 barrels per day of that shale decline for the moment at least. Meanwhile, the US's domestic oil consumption, of course, remains about 20 million barrels per day. And last on the list, Vietnam, who is now up over 700,000 barrels per day of domestic consumption. And after holding a plateau in the mid 300s for a few decades, their production has declined down close to 150, this time coming in at 168. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon links are down there with the YouTube, whatever buttons and everything. If you want to support me, only do so if you actually can. The link to the Drive folder with all these graphs and many other different kinds of graphs is in the description. That's free to access at any time. There's a link in the top pinned comment to my cat's YouTube channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.